Well, 5 down, 5 more to go. And we're actually going to take care of 2 of them in one video, actually. Instead of doing them in individual videos because of a certain thing that's going on with these 2 albums I'm about to review, which is Deliverance and Damnation, part of the Opeth discography. Now, the reason why I didn't, some people who are new to this channel, or people who have seen my reviews, this is the first time ever I am reviewing 2 albums in one video. And some people might wonder, why are you doing that? Well, with Deliverance and Damnation, these are companion albums. And what is it? And what makes them companion albums is because it's like a dark and lighter night and day kind of idea, where Deliverance is a very heavy progressive death metal album, where Damnation is more of a traditional progressive rock album. And we're going to talk about Deliverance first, and before I get into it, the backstory behind these 2 CDs is the band was picking up a lot of steam after Blackwater Park came out, when they had a hit with Harvest and Draperty Falls was a single from the album. And they were getting a lot of record sales by this point. And they came out a year later with Deliverance. And Deliverance and Damnation was intended to be a double album released on the same day, but they decided to release them separately, only 5 months apart. Deliverance was released at near the end of 2002, and Damnation was released around spring of '03. But with Deliverance, wow, you want to talk about heavy brutality in progressive music. Just like Blackwater Park and Still Life, there's a lot of brutal, heavy moments. Although I'd say the coolest part, the production on Deliverance was highly immense. I mean, the drums sounded mega crushing. The guitars were heavier. The melodies were stronger. And this was the second time we got to see the whole collaboration with Opeth and Steven Wilson again, just like we saw on Blackwater Park. Now with Deliverance, you kick off the album with a song like Wreath. And Wreath is just like a really slow opening track that's just very heavy, very brutal, and just great playing throughout the whole track. The title track, Deliverance, is actually one of my favorites, if not maybe my favorite off this album, because it just had a lot of brutality behind it with the growls, and also just heavy guitars, intricate structures. A Fair Judgment was another great track for this album for me, another one of my favorites, because it just has that idea behind it where it's slow, but then you get some pacing going on, and it just overall created a really cool atmosphere behind it. For Absent Friends, which was an instrumental at a little over 2 minutes, the song was named after the song from Genesis' Nursery Crimes album in 1971, and Genesis was a big influence on Opeth, and they decided to take the name of the song but make their own version with an instrumental behind it. But Master's Apprentices was another one of those crazy songs that really can get you going throughout the entire 10.5-minute journey of it. And then you close it out with the song By the Pain I See in Others, which was the longest song of the album at nearly 14 minutes. Another brutal, heavy track. Really, I noticed with Deliverance, the clean vocals got a little bit less on Deliverance. They add in more death growls than what they did on Blackwater Park, but to me, that's what made this album a little bit heavier than some of the other work, like My Arms, Your Hearse, for example. But with Deliverance, it was the dark album, it was the brutal and heavy release that that set the stage for what the next album was going to be, because Deliverance was the dark, nightly type of album. And Deliverance, overall, I give Deliverance a solid 9.75 out of 10. I thought this was a great release. I really loved how they got heavier on the album with a lot more death vocals and a little bit of less clean vocals. But that didn't lower the score, really. I mean, yeah. And also, this was an album that was a shorter track listing at only 6 tracks, when Morning Rise had 5. This had 6. But Deliverance, yes, like I said, I give it a 9.75 out of 10. I thought it was a great album. Now we're going to talk about Damnation. Now, Damnation was a radical departure for Opeth, where this album pretty much eliminates any kind of metal influence, to the point where this album was just straight up old school progressive rock with mostly acoustic guitars or a soft guitar sound. There are some electric parts throughout, but for the most part this is a much more progressive melodic album, with the opening track being the longest song, Window Pane, which was a great track. Same with every other song on Damnation, really. I mean, like In My Time of Need, Death Whispered a Lullaby, Closure, Hope Leaves, To Rid the Disease, which was actually one of the more creepy songs of the album, because it just had like this haunting keyboard behind it that kind of sounds like stuff you would hear from like the Halloween movies. But it just kept on with that darkness behind that track. Ending Credits, which was an instrumental at full 3.5 minutes, and then the closing track, Weakness, which was just like a really cool way to close the album out, with a lot of the keyboards going on throughout and some crazy sounds. But the song Death Whispered a Lullaby was one of my favorite tracks on Damnation, because it just has that. Even though this was the lighter album and the day album, this was a dark lyrical gem. I mean, like, the lyrics you hear are pretty dark, or regarding like death and sleep or something like that. To Rid the Disease was like another like dark atmospheric track. I mean, with Damnation, they really tried to improve on the atmosphere of the entire presentation as compared to like the other albums before. But Damnation, like I said, radical departure. They eliminated pretty much all of the metal influence and pretty much went for like a 70s prog sound, where it kind of really reminds me more of like Genesis or Yes than anything else. But it was still a great release nonetheless. But I give this album a 9.25 out of 10. Great album, but right now on the list it is the weakest album, only for the reason that there could have been a little bit more done with it, in my opinion. Like maybe a couple more tracks might have helped it, because this at the point was the shortest Opeth album at only like 40-some minutes, whereas the other albums were over an hour. Well, My Arms Rehearsed was about 53 minutes. At that time, that was the shortest Opeth album, but Damnation was shorter, and that's what kind of made the album suffer a little bit, is because you know they could have done a whole lot more with this 1970s progressive rock sound. But we would get to that in their last 2 albums, Heritage and Pale Communion. But Damnation, in my opinion, was kind of tame compared to Pale Communion as far as the overall sound. As far as Heritage, we'll see about Heritage when we get to it. But overall, with Damnation, another great release. Deliverance topped it, though. But for a double album idea to combine the efforts together, I give both efforts combined a 9.5 out of 10. I thought this was a really cool experiment that both albums were recorded at the same time, but just released 5 months apart. But it was still an ambitious idea for Opeth to try to do a dark and light or night and day kind of idea. And it worked out well for him, no doubt. But anyways, we're going to get to another album next, and it's going to be one album that a lot of Opeth fans were keeping a microscope on due to a record label change, whereas these 2 albums, as well as Blackwater Park, was released on Music for Nations or KOCH Records, and Still Life was on Peaceville. We're going to be talking about Ghost Reveries next, their first album with Roadrunner. But until then, see you to it.